Hello, my fifth graders, and welcome to Unit 3. So we're actually in a whole nother unit. Last unit, we talked a lot about cycles and how different items cycle and go over and over and over and over and over, right? So this unit, we're learning about different world communities and celebrating those world communities, which really works well with where we are in the year with all of our different cultures and our celebrations that we have right now. So, some of the main idea questions that you're going to be looking at for this unit is what do you have in common with people around the world? And how are we connected to people from other cultures? Now, for some of you, that might be a really obvious question, but hopefully we'll be digging a little bit deeper into that for this unit. So, for our first story, we're reading a story called Island Treasures. And growing up in Cuba, which is why on the screen in front of you, you have a map. Wistful is our main vocabulary, is our vocabulary that's going to kind of encompass what this story is about. And that's characterized by feelings of regret or longing, often occurred with memories. So, Island Treasures growing up in Cuba. This is Cuba right here. And you can see this is Florida, the Bahamas, and Cuba. Cuba, up until recently, was actually, we weren't able to go there. I mean, there were certain, like we were able to go here because that's part of the United States, but we were not able to go to Cuba because they were a communist country. And so this story kind of goes a little bit into that. The essential questions of our story is, have you been told stories about your ancestors or the people in your family? What lessons have you learned from those stories? And I'm going to be asking you to share, what are some different stories you've been told about your ancestors? And I'm going to share some of the stories that I've been told about my ancestors as well. So here's Cuba. This is also a picture of what it looks like there. So it looks just like anywhere else, right? For Island Treasures, as you can see, I will move my whiteboard. Close it up, move it over. As you can see, it is an autobiography. Auto meaning self, bio meaning life, and graphy meaning to write. It's got 3 roots. Oh, so good for my word analysis. So it's a self-life written. So it's written by the author. So the author, it's about the author's life. So an autobiography is written by the author about her life, where a biography is just about a person. So then you should know that this is a true story. I am going to do something a little different and have the computer read it. And I'm going to go back and check my settings to make sure you'll be able to hear my computer, mainly because they use a lot of Spanish words that are beautiful, but that I would not be able to pronounce correctly. And I think it's important that you are able to hear the words correctly. So let me check to make sure it's on the correct settings. That did nothing, so I'm going to just check it now.
Introduction. At La Quinta Simone, the weathered old house where I was born and where I lived for much of my childhood, the magic began early in the morning when my grandmother would wake me up for our daily visit to the cows. In Cuba, only prized cows in large haciendas lived in barns. Our handful of cows lived outdoors, grazing on grass all year round. When our farmhand milked the cows under a tree, my grandmother would hand him a large glass, and he would direct a squirt of milk straight into it. She always let me drink first, and as I raised the glass, holding it with both hands, the foam on top would tickle my nose. Later in the day, the magic continued. I was allowed to roam our fields freely, and I would spend long stretches of time by the river.
While I'm listening to this, I'm looking at my first read, right? The very first thing says visualizing. And when we visualize, we picture the story going on in our head. And usually I ask my class, like, how many of you visualize the story? Whenever I read, it's like watching a movie, which I know is kind of a weird concept. I have the pictures going on in my head. When I am reading, I am constantly visualizing what is going on in our story. So, what descriptions help you visualize the setting? When I look here, what are those descriptions that are helping me visualize? What is the author doing that is making those stories come out in our heads so well? So a lot of what we do when we read is we also are learning how to become amazing writers ourselves. So what are those descriptions besides sight? What sounds, smells, taste, touch are you visualizing with this scene? So as I listen, I'm going to be filling this out for myself. You can either copy what I write or add your own.
Observing the fish. The small guajacones, who skimmed the surface eating mosquito larvae. The swift biejacas, swimming deep in the water. The brown renecullos, tadpoles at different stages of turning into frogs. The large green tadpoles with yellow bellies would turn into ranjas toro, the bullfrogs we heard at night. Since these were not easy to spot, seeing one was a rare treat. This was also true of yicotes, river turtles whose hearing was very sharp. No matter how quietly I approached, all I could see were the ripples they left behind, because they would jump off their rocks and into the water before I even reached the river. There was also the large fallen tree that lay on the ground close to the river, a resting giant with a number of branches that grew straight up from its side. If I had known then what a harp looked like, I would have said it resembled one. Instead, for me, the fallen tree was a many-masted sailing ship on a daring voyage, and I read many tales of adventure while nestled there.
All right.
Our own patio was filled with a multitude of wonders. The fragrance of orange blossoms, particularly after it rained, the surprise of finding lizards' eggs under the ferns, the excitement of watching my grandmother's many hens gather around us as we fed them ground corn or fresh canutillo leaves harvested from the riverbanks. And there was a powerful magic in my grandmother's stories. When recounting the heroic deeds of Cuban patriots during the struggle for independence, she would always remind me that the brave and wise Ignacio Agramonte had wooed his sweetheart, Amelia Simoni, right here in this garden. My grandmother's stories about the ancient Greek gods made them feel so real that I imagined them around every corner, and her animal stories changed with each delightful retelling, weaving in details of whatever was happening around us. There was truly wonder everywhere, in kites flying on windy days, in paper boats sailing after the rains, and in the simple games we played to tunes that had been sung for hundreds of years. Capturing the magic of these simple days at La Quinta Simone and passing it on to you, that is what the following story is all about.
Now, what is the prediction that we can make that's going to happen in this story? So she really did kind of set us up for this story. She's telling us all about what her life was like there. Capturing those simple days and passing it on to you. That's what this story is about. Now, this is just a picture of the actual story. So if you want to find it, Island Treasures Growing Up in Cuba is an actual book. This is just one excerpt from that book. So I want you to make a prediction. Because she sounds so wistful, I predict she will move, right? Moving is a pretty common thing, so maybe she had to move away somewhere, some reason why, right? I predict that she will have to move away from Cuba. All right, so that's my prediction. Make sure you write a prediction as well. But one thing I want you to note is in this, where they're talking about her grandmother's stories and the garden, and I wonder if you can hear how wistful she sounds, that feeling of regret or longing that occurs pretty often with memories, like remembering how it used to be. Choices.
Choices. My father's family and my mother's family were as different from each other as a quiet mountain stream and the vast ocean. My father's family was small in contrast to my mother's.
Whoa, 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 whoa. That is so awesome. My mother's family were as different from each other as a quiet mountain stream and vast ocean. Like, picture that. Oh, the play of words there. That quiet mountain stream, and then you see that vast ocean and how different they are. So the author didn't just say, yeah, our families were different. She said they're as different as that quiet mountain stream and the vast ocean. Like the way that is written is a lot better to visualize than just saying, yeah, our families were different.
With its many aunts, uncles, first and second cousins, great aunts and great uncles. But not only was my mother's family large, it was also very lively, cheerful, and adventurous, while my father's father and brothers were quiet people who seldom spoke about anything personal. We frequently spent our evenings together listening to stories of my mother's family. Through these stories, people whom I had never met seemed as familiar to me as those who lived nearby. It seemed as though I had heard their voices and taken part in their adventures. But it is a story told to me by my father's father that I would like to share with you now. A story that remains vivid in my memory and that has greatly shaped who I am today.
Has anyone ever had that occur where you have heard stories, even if you were there and maybe you were too young to actually remember the stories, but you remember them because you've heard the stories so many times? I have many memories of that, of my grandparents and things like that, of events that I was never there for, but I remember them so vividly now because I've heard so many stories and that art of storytelling coming down and coming down. All right, so now on these pages, we're going to be looking for those descriptions that help us visualize. You don't need to write with complete sentences. You can write bullet points, right? You can write exactly what I'm writing. Nothing of what I've written is a complete sentence. Write bullet points. What are you hearing that's helping you visualize those senses that you have, right? Sound, smell, taste.
Abuelito Modesto would stop by my house every afternoon for a short visit. He would pat me on the head or give me a formal kiss on the forehead, and then he would sit and talk with my parents about the political and social issues of the day. He sounded very knowledgeable to me, but also adult and remote. He was a large, formidable man, and although I listened in fascination to his words, I felt as if it would be many years before I would be able to share anything with him, or he with me. One afternoon, when he arrived, my parents had gone out, and I was the only one at home. He sat to wait for them in the dining room, the coolest room in the city house where we lived at the time. The house was bathed in the quiet so prevalent in the tropics during the hottest part of the day. As usual, I was buried in a book. Then, Abuelito Modesto called my name and motioned for me to sit on his lap. I was surprised by this gesture of warmth and affection, since I was almost 10 years old, and especially since he never asked any of us to sit by him. Yet I welcomed the invitation to get close to this man who seemed so remote and yet so wise. I never knew what prompted him to tell me the story that came next, but I have always treasured it. You probably know that I was once very wealthy, he began. As I nodded, he continued, I was only 12 years old when I left Spain to come to Cuba. My father had died, and since my oldest brother was arrogant and very authoritarian, I decided to leave my home at La Coruna. I roamed the port until someone pointed out a ship that was about to sail, and I managed to hide aboard. A sailor...
Can you imagine that? He snuck aboard a ship to come to Cuba. That is crazy adventurous. He roamed the port until someone pointed out a ship that was about to sail, and he hid aboard.
Discovered me shortly after the ship set sail, but the captain said I should sail with them, and when we arrived at Havana, he helped me get ashore. I searched for work, and fortunately I was taken in by the owner of a hardware store. He worked me hard. I cleaned the store and helped with all kinds of odd jobs. I had to sleep in the storage room on some burlap sacks, but I learned the business well. One day, a young American came into the store with a surprising machine that played music from round black discs. It was made in the United States and was called a gramophone. I was astonished and excited. Imagine a machine that could bring the great opera singer Enrico Caruso's voice into each home. The hardware store owner didn't want anything to do with this machine, but I was fascinated by it. I followed the American when he left the store and offered to work for him. For the next few years, I sold this new invention. Eventually, I became the major representative in Cuba for the manufacturer and traveled the island from end to end. I loved the land around Camagüey, and I saw how cattle would thrive on these fertile plains, so I bought some land. The land turned out to be even more valuable than I thought, and I became wealthy. He paused. Even though I didn't know the meaning of the word nostalgia, I know now that is exactly what I saw in his eyes. The years passed, he continued. I married your grandmother, and we had 4 sons. Then she became very ill. Since she was too ill to be moved, I had a doctor come to the hacienda. But although he did all he could, she did not improve. One evening, an exhausted horse and rider galloped up to the hacienda. The rider was my business manager in Havana. He'd ridden at top speed from the train station in Camagüey, and close up, I saw that it was not only exhaustion that marked his face, but panic. You must come to Havana immediately, he urged me. There is a financial crisis, and the economy is collapsing. The president of your bank sent me to warn you. It's urgent that you travel to the capital in person to withdraw all of your money, or else it will be lost. I considered his alarming news as the man looked at me impatiently, unable to understand why I wasn't ordering fresh horses to take us to the train. But was I to leave your ill grandmother? He paused again, and I saw that the look in his eyes had changed. This new feeling was one I recognized even as a child. My own eyes must have looked the same the day I found a bird, which only a short while ago had been alive, lying dead in our backyard.
All right, so one of his workers wrote up saying, hey, the economy's going to collapse. If you don't get to the bank right away and take your money out, you will lose all of your money. And that is what happened. The economy in Cuba collapsed under the new government that went into play. So instead of doing that, he asked, how can I leave my wife? She is sick. I cannot leave her right now.
My grandfather finished his story. I did not return with him. Your grandmother did not get well, and the economy did collapse before I could get my money from the bank. I was no longer a rich man, but I was there by your grandmother's side until the end, and I held her hand in mine as she passed away. I looked down at my grandfather's big hand, which was covering my own, and then I knew I would not have to wait until I grew up to understand my grandfather Modesto. There is no one alive today who remembers Maria Repaz, the grandmother I never knew, and there are probably very few people living who remember my quiet but steadfast grandfather Modesto. Yet I am certain that these ancestors of mine live on in my children, who have known from a young age what choices to make where loved ones are concerned.
Perfect. I think that's the end. Yeah. So when I look at these questions here, right? Why do you think Abuelito Modesto's story was so vivid to this author? He told her this story when she was nothing but a little girl. So why do you think Abuelito Modesto's story was so vivid to her? So for that, I would put down, it was so vivid because it was from her grandfather, who didn't talk a lot, right? But when he did, oh, my handwriting is awful. I don't know why I always praise you guys. But when he did, this is the story he chose. So you know that this story obviously meant a lot to him as well. It explains a lot about who her grandfather was. So how do you think this story shaped the author into who she is today? Well, it says it right here at the end, right? Yet I am certain that these ancestors of mine live on in my own children. So she told those stories to her children. And mainly she told those stories to her children to teach them how important it is about family, to her children about the importance of family. Of family, right? Why do you think the author told it? She told those stories to her children about the importance of family and how important family is. All right, you guys, that's day one for our story.